Air Vice Marshal J.E. Johnny Johnson joined the RAF Volunteer Reserve previous to World War II. In 1941, while stationed at Tangmere with 616 Squadron, he flew in the lead section with Douglas Bata when Bata led that wing. In the summer of 1942, he was promoted to command 610 County of Chester Squadron, and early in 1943 promoted wing commander to lead the Canadian Spitfire wing at Kenley. During the spring and summer of 1943, he led the wing on 140 missions over northwest Europe, including the escorting of the flying fortresses of the 8th Air Force. Short rest from operations, he was posted to lead another Canadian Spitfire wing, number 144. The wing was first to land in France 2 days after D-Day. From this location, the exhilarating Buccaneering trek across France into northwest Europe began. In early 1945, he was promoted group captain and commanded number 125 wing, which had been equipped with Spitfire 14s. At the end of the war, he was the leading RAF fighter pilot with 38 confirmed victories. Following the war, he attended the Royal Canadian Air Force Staff College in Toronto, and then served with the United States Air Force for more than 3 years, including active service in Korea. In 1950, he commanded RAF Cottesmore, the first Victor bomber station. His last appointment was Air Officer Commanding Air Forces Middle East. He retired from the Royal Air Force in 1966. Sir, to start our interview, perhaps we could draw attention to the rosette that you're wearing on your lapel. I understand that that is a decoration that you have received, and there is a story behind it.
Well, the story behind it was that 2 years ago, I was in France to take part in a ceremony at the Arc de Triomphe, rekindling the flame, which is the Arc de Triomphe, which they do incidentally every day, and I was in uniform, and the French noticed that I didn't have a French decoration, although I got Belgium and American decorations. So last year, that would be 1988, 44 years after the event, I was awarded the Légion d'Honneur for taking the Canadian Spitfire wing 144 into Normandy, as you've just mentioned, on D-Day.
Better late than never, sir.
Better late than never.
Now, to go back to the very start of your flying career, you became interested in flying in what you referred to as the golden age of flying, between the wars.
Yes.
However, your introduction to military flying was through an auxiliary squadron or a volunteer reserve squadron in the United Kingdom.
Well, that's not quite correct, no. I was in the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve before the war started, where they taught us to fly at the weekends and the summer evenings, and we attended lectures in our own time. And the Auxiliary Air Force was a more exclusive, far more exclusive organization than the Volunteer Reserve. But when I joined my first squadron after training in August of 1940, when the Battle of Britain was at its height, I joined an auxiliary squadron, 616, the South Yorkshire Squadron, and remained with them for some time.
Almost 1/3 of the total number of squadrons, I understand, at that time were auxiliary squadrons.
They were, yes, they were, and although they were relatively inefficient when the war started, you soon couldn't tell the difference between the auxiliary and the regular squadrons.
You mentioned your own initial training, sir, with the squadron. What type of aircraft would you have flown for your initial training?
The Tiger Moth, which was being seen in the skies of Canada, was a great trainer, and followed by the advanced trainer was the Miles Master. I don't think you had the Harvards in Canada, didn't you?
That's correct.
And then from the Master straight on to the Spitfire.
Now, during the course of the war, or in later years during the course of the war, one would go on to an operational training unit before joining a squadron. Did you have the opportunity for this, or would you have gone directly from initial training?
No, we went to an operational training unit where I think we did a dozen hours on Spitfires only. And then we didn't have any tactical lectures. It was that was a great gap in the tactical training at that time. I don't suppose there was time. And the fighter command's tactics were very, very poor. And also there was a tradition in the Air Force in those days that you never discussed tactics after in the officers' mess. or the sergeant's mess at the end of the day. I think that stemmed from the First War, when they had a lot of losses and so on in the Billy Bishop's time and what have you. And we were discouraged from discussing how to fight the Germans, that sort of thing, over a glass of beer. That didn't last very long, I can tell you. We sort of soon put that right, because when I got a position of any authority myself, as a flight commander and squadron commander, we had debriefings where we went into the thing very carefully and learnt what we could from each encounter with the Germans.
Now, you mentioned, sir, also that you went from the initially Fleet-Finched Miles Master and then to the Spitfire. This must have been a pretty big leap in that.
It was a big leap, yes. It was a big leap from the Miles Master to the Spitfire. The Spitfire, you were in a different machine altogether, you know, far more powerful machine, and
armament, of course, as well.
Pardon?
Armament
armament, yes, and but you really wanted to turn a Spitfire upside down and feel at one with the airplane. I say with her because it was a very feminine airplane. I always thought, I think every pilot who flew Spitfires a long time had a love affair with them, you know. I did anyway.
Yes.
And but you wanted 50 hours before you could forget about the airplane and then you'd float on your back or do this and so on and so on. And there wasn't time for that in the Battle of Britain. Yeah. And in my case, my own case, the squadron I was posted to in August of 1940, 616 Squadron, they lost half the squadron had been shot down or wounded in one encounter. And Dowding, the Commander-in-Chief, pulled them out of the front line and sent them up to a place called Coltishall in Norfolk to re-equip with pilots like me. And that really saved my life, I think. If I'd have been thrown into the Battle of Britain in that, or with 10 hours or 12 hours on a Spitfire, I don't think you and I would be sort of sitting here today.
Right.
And a lot of volunteer reservists, my own contemporaries, were killed at that time.
When you returned from this training period then, this would have been to Tangmere, I guess, with...
No, it was a Coltishall, really. Coltishall in 1940.
Yes, following that, though, when you went back into operational flying, was this back to the Tangmere wing?
No, we were flying operationally from Coltishall in 1940, and that's the thing. The Tangmere wing was in the following year, which was led by Bata, who I had previously met in 1940, he and Stan Turner, the Canadian RAF, because Bata was given command of a Canadian fighter squadron, 242 Squadron, which he reformed at Coltishall in Norfolk. And that squadron had been very badly kicked about and in France, very badly led. It had lost, the CEO had disappeared somewhere. They'd lost all the clothes, all the money, and France disintegrated. And it was Bata's job to try and sort of get that squadron into a fighting unit again.
You had the opportunity of flying in the very same section with Bata as well.
In 1941?
In 1941.
Yes, yes.
Now you mentioned Stan Turner. Stan Turner, I believe, was brought into the Tangmere wing by Bata to head one of the...
Yes, but previous to that he'd been Bata's number 2 man in the squadron, in 242 Squadron. So when Bata was promoted to lead the Tangmere wing, he immediately asked for Stan Turner to come and command one of his squadrons, which is 141 Squadron, I think it was. 145 Squadron, I believe, yes.
Now, Stan Turner's job, as I understand, within that wing was primarily to provide high cover.
He was always the high cover squadron. Bata always flew in the same form. He always flew with our squadron. That's how I got to know him so well. So not only did he fly with 616 Squadron, but he always insisted that Dundas, Smith, and me would fly in his section of 4. And then he'd have 610 Squadron over Downson and high above Stan Turner with 145 Squadron as top cover. That was the pattern we flew in those days.
Now, there's no doubt that Bata himself was a leader. Consequently, I would think his selection of Stan Turner as a deputy or as a squadron commander would also draw attention to his leadership qualities.
Oh, he was a good leader. Stan, he was sometimes an awkward man, a difficult man on the ground, if you know what I mean. You've been a naval officer. But in the air, he never knew when it was time to go home. He'd always be in there, Stan. He'd always fight to the very, very, very end and back you up. And Bata was lost, shot down on, I think, middle of August anyway, I think it's the 21st of August, 1941, And I always contend that if Stanton had been there with his squadron, Bata wouldn't have been shot down. But he'd been taken out of the Tangmere wing about a couple of weeks beforehand.
Very reluctantly, too, I understand.
Very reluctantly. He didn't want to go, no.
And I understand when he got to his next posting, there were perhaps complications that came out of this due to the fact that he had a propensity for firing off a very large caliber pistol.
I'm told that the pistol was produced when he went up to the north, and they shot pictures off the wall to the consternation of the station commander.
Returning to Bata again, sir, and the very section that you flew with him. Now, I believe that he instituted the finger four formation, or is that correct?
As far, yes, I think the Tangmere wing we used to fly in we got away from the Vics of 3, which was the dreadful thing that most squadrons were trained on, and flew in the Battle of Britain, the tight Vic of 3. And when we got down to the Tangmere wing, we flew in 4s, 3/4s line astern. And then Bata and Dundas got experimenting, and they sort of devised the finger 4. Well, they didn't devise it because the Germans have been flying in it since the Spanish Civil War.
I see. So that's where the
original
idea
That's
came from.
Galland and Moulders and those guys. They devised the Rot, which was the 2 airplane, and the Schwarm, which was the 4, for the Messerschmitt 109 in the Spanish Civil War, which formation is still flown today by the fighter jocks.
And what particular advantages did this finger 4 have over, say, line astern?
You had more cross cover. You had more cross cover, and there was no Arsène Charlie.
Which would have, I believe, was the original position that you would have occupied in the section when you flew with Bata.
That's the position I should have been in, Arsène Charlie, yes.
And a very difficult position as well.
But in the line astern, you see, you were all up there more or less with the same chance. So it was more popular with the boys.
Now, the type of operations that were being conducted out of Tangmere when you flew with Bata before he was shot down in August of 41, would these be the circuses?
These would be the circus operations, yes, these were the circus operations.
Could you tell me a little bit about what a circus operation would involve?
The circus operation, we thought the Germans had come and attack us again in the spring of 1941. So we were basically a defensive organization in fighter command, but we got a lot more squadrons. We get up to nearly 100 squadrons have been formed, a total of nearly 100 squadrons as opposed to the 55 or 60 in the Battle of Britain. And we waited for the Germans to come, and when they didn't, then we started to go flying over fighter sweeps over France and the Low Countries, which the Germans didn't react to. I mean, a fighter sweep did very little at 30,000 feet, wasn't doing a great deal of damage. So then they started to give a few bombers to bomb their airfields, and that was what the circus operation was.
These were numbered consecutively, the circuses?
Beg pardon?
They were numbered consecutively, and I believe the first circus number 1 started.
Yes, they were. Yes, they were.
At that time.
Yes. And that had the effect of stinging the German fighter force to come up and fight and so on.
What type of bombers would you have escorted back in
in
41?
those days we escorted a twin-engine Blenheim, the twin-engine Blenheim bomber, and I think in 1941 I saw for the first time a Sterling 4-engine bomber, which looked enormous to me, and we escorted just three of them to a daylight target.
We mentioned circuses then, sir. One other operation is the rhubarb. Could you describe the difference between a circus then and a
rhubarb? Well, a rhubarb operation, which I personally didn't like, was you took advantage of low cloud and bad weather, and 1 or 2 Spitfires would slip over the French coast in cloud and then let down, which was dangerous enough because you didn't always know where you were, you had no navigation aids. The idea was you let down and you shot up any rolling stock or German cars or
opportunity
targets. We lost a lot of people on those rhubarb operations, and because the Spitfire had a little glycol tank, a little coolant tank in front of the belly, and it only wanted 1 small bullet through it, and you lost your coolant and your engine seized up and you were brought down. And when I got into some authority, a position of some authority, I fought against rhubarbs, unless there was a very special target.
Now, in August of 41, Douglas Bata was shot down, and I imagine that this had a very profound effect on the wing as well.
Yes, as I say, Stan Turner wasn't with us with his squadron. The squadron which should have been in place, top cover, failed to make the rendezvous on that day, so we didn't have a good top cover. Bata's own RT was bad. He didn't have his airspeed indicator. Everything had gone wrong for Bata. He should have gone home, really, when things started to go wrong, and hand over the wing and so on. But he wasn't that sort of chap. And he pressed on. We were badly bounced by some 109s, and he was hacked down. And he said he always claimed he collided with somebody, but he didn't. We've had a very great post-mortem on it many times. We've had Adolfo Galland, the German general who was flying at the time, we've had the various, and we've produced the man who shot Bata down. And eventually he recognised that he had been shot down and not collided with somebody.
Well, now, sir, later on in that year, you moved on to another squadron as the commanding officer of the squadron. 610 Squadron?
610 Squadron, yes.
610 Squadron. Was that squadron involved in operations, or they were up in the north, I understand?
We were up in the Norfolk coast, mostly doing anti-shipping operations off the Dutch coast. But then we moved down to the south for the Dieppe operation. You remember when the Canadian forces, I think 10,000 were put ashore. I think that was about the number, wasn't it? 10,000
yes.
Suffered the most
yes, sir.
Enormous casualties.
You were
3,000 killed or wounded, wasn't
That's right. Attacking force of about 5,000 with about 80% casualty, I believe, overall.
5,000, yes, not
yes.
yes.
That particular day, sir, you were flying out of England, and you were at various squadrons were offering support over the landing area, and you had a grandstand seat. I would suggest that your level was, I believe, around 10,000 feet. Can you describe what you saw that day?
Well, you see, we were briefed for days before. I mean, the operation had been planned in July, I think, and then it had been postponed. The security was very bad about the Dieppe Operation Dynamo, I think it was called. And we were briefed that there was going to be an air controller on board one of the naval destroyers who would tell us about enemy formations, that the Canadians would capture an airfield just behind the town where we could land, and so on and so forth. And when we got over on the first patrol at about 6 o'clock, just after dawn on the first morning, and I tried to call the control ship and got no reply. And then I tried to call the people who should have been on the beach, got no reply from there. And we soon realized that things were not going quite according to plan. We got into some fighting ourselves, and I went down, I had to go down to sea level to get out of Dieppe on that first patrol, and caught a glimpse of the beach, and it was apparent to me that a lot of the tanks had been bogged down and we hadn't got a foothold on shore.
By noon that day, the withdrawal was being attempted, and
yes.
this went on for the course of the day.
Yes.
Your squadron and the other squadrons that were involved in this operation flew a number of sorties, not a single, but I understand in some cases 3 and even 4 sorties.
We flew 4 sorties that day, of an hour and a half to 2 hours each. Yes, we did.
A Royal Air Force officer who was particularly busy that day was Group Captain Broadhurst, I understand.
Yes.
He made a number of trips from this, and it's been said that from the Dieppe raid, the lessons for D-Day were learned. I believe that's true to some degree.
Expensive way to learn, wasn't it?
Very expensive, very expensive.
Yes, I think Chester Wilmot, the great historian and writer, said it yielded a bloody experience of, or yielded bloody knowledge of the cost of breaching the Atlantic Wall. It was going to be a very expensive and hazardous, well, not hazardous, but it was going to be, it gave us warning, didn't it, that they were going to be a very tough nut to crack.
On that particular day, a gentleman by the name of Franks has written a book called The Greatest Air Battle. And this is referred to because of the actual geographic area that the battle involved. There was up to maybe 30,000 feet, but within about a 25-mile cylinder.
Well, I don't believe that. I didn't see it myself, but in 1940, when the Germans, in September the 15th, my friend Al Deer tells me that when the first German bomber formations were crossing, were coming up the Thames, the last ones were crossing our south coast. They were 25 or 30 miles in length, and 13 or 1400 airplanes in total, you know, an armada. I think that was the biggest thing we saw, the biggest air battle we saw, until Uncle Sam came over with these hordes of bloody fortresses and Mustangs and things.
On that particular day, sir, again, the physical requirement for flying 3 and 4 sorties, I would imagine at the end of that day that everyone was pretty tired. I would suggest that between sorties, there'd be the adrenaline there, that knowing you're going back would keep you pumped up. But when it was over, was there much of a lag effect that would have caught up with one?
Oh, I think so. You see, we were up before the dawn, and we flew till August, when the dusk was, what, 10 or 11 o'clock. So we went to bed feeling pretty depressed, really. We were tired, but and we'd flown a lot and done all we could to help, but it wasn't in our hands, was it? I mean, the chaps on the ground we knew were in a bloody mess and so on and so forth, and we began to get messages in the afternoon of the casualties and so on, and there was nothing we could do about it. We felt very badly about it. We felt very badly for the chaps on the ground.
Did you have a chance of meeting any of the people who returned from that raid shortly afterwards? Or
only my own pilots who were shot down. I lost a couple of pilots on that day, an Australian called Craig, and he came back and sort of was picked up by the Royal Navy and sort of came back with some of the survivors and said what a bloody mess it was.
Now the Channel, without doubt, is a very significant geographical location, and it was for you people, particularly in Fighter Command. You mentioned that you had one pilot down in the Channel. Could you tell us a little bit about there's air-sea rescue people, particularly the ones flying the Walrus aircraft? They had a pretty dangerous job there, I understand.
Well, we started the war with no air-sea rescue organisation, and then I think Dowding in 1940 came to some arrangement with the admiral who was commanding whatever it was. What command would that be? The Home Command or something or other in the Channel, who made a number of patrol craft available to him to pick up the pilots and that sort of thing. And then the fishermen went out and picked people up, but it was all very ad hoc. And I mean, I was writing a bit for a book, which, am I allowed to say that I'm writing a book on the Battle of Britain, published next week, next month, next year. But I was writing a bit, and there was a true story of one or two pilots had been shot down, and the naval rescue picked up one pilot, the naval launch, and they were coming back to somewhere on the south coast, and there was an old lady who picked in a Rhine boat all by herself, who'd gone out from the south coast about a couple of miles to pick up another guy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, an old lady of 50 or 60.
This was something that your fighter squadron, not only your fighter squadron, but all squadrons were concerned with, a pilot down in the water. Quite frequently, an aircraft would be assigned to circuit. So
well,
that
later on, you see, as you were saying, we got the Walrus, yes. Walrus airplanes, amphibians, which are very slow and very vulnerable. And, I mean, we picked up Buck McNair, who's a great Canadian, one of my squadron commanders in 1943, who was on fire and I think received burns from which he never fully recovered. And he was picked up, I would have thought, about a mile off Dunkirk. Tremendous operation, really. We'd left men over him, you know, and then sent people back so that we never left sight of him and his dinghy. Conrad was picked up from Boulogne Harbour. Kiefer made his way back from France, and there were some most tremendous pickups from those Walrus. They're very brave people.
Now, the fact that a pilot would be down in the Channel, either on the Allied side or on the German side, they offered the same sort of protection, I would imagine, until rescue could be effected, or attempted at least.
Yes, they were.
This would have in itself resulted in some sort of local battles, I would assume, once aircraft were seen circling.
Well, the Germans were very much ahead of us in their sea rescue, and they had a very good with their Heinkel seaplanes. And for a start, the order was to we fighter pilots that they were to be left alone. And then some nut said they were carrying out reconnaissance or they were reporting movements of shipping and that sort of thing. So we received orders to shoot them down and so on and so forth, and which I thought was a bad business.
With 610 Squadron, sir, you would have carried the rank of squadron leader.
Squadron leader, yes.
And that would have been in 1942, which is 2 short years after you were into the war.
Yes.
You were then promoted in January or early in 1943 to take on the wing in Kenley, the Canadian, all-Canadian wing. Do you recall your thoughts at that time when?
Well, you see, everybody sort of said, you see, I suppose, well, we hadn't had much experience of the Canadians, you see, apart from Stanton and 1 or 2 more like him, who shot the sort of pictures off the wall at Catterick and so on. And everybody said, oh my goodness, you get up there, you take the Canadians, you know, they're a wild bunch of cowboys, you'll never be able to control them, so on and so forth, bad luck, old boy, so on. In fact, they were the best disciplined and best trained wing, I would say, in fighter command. And Bud Malloy, who was finished life as a Gulf Pro, didn't he, at Uplands here, and a chap called Foss Bolton, they were my 2 squadron commanders, first-class chaps. And we had a great year together, I think, a great year.
When you arrived at the Kenley wing, sir, you had the opportunity then of having your own initials put on your personal Spitfire.
Yes.
JEJ appeared.
Yes.
This was your choice as well. It was suggested at one time that this might be a beacon, perhaps, and draw more attention.
Well, you see, it arose from the fact that squadrons had code letters assigned to them. Like 6161 was YQ, and 610 Squadron was DW. So when you became a wing commander, you see, you didn't really have a squadron, I should say. You began to put your initials on them. I think Harry Broadhouse, who you mentioned, he was the first chap ever to do it. He put HB on it. And my intelligence officer came to me and said, you shouldn't have your initials put on. He said, that'll be a target. The Germans will know you're the wing commander flying, and they'll make, you'll be the sort of prime target. And I said, well, that's just what we bloody well want, don't we? So we'll get them round up there and sort of, see what we can do with them.
When you went to the Canadian wing, sir, the finger four formation, you brought that with you, I understand.
No, they flew in the old line of stern formation, old Malloy and Foss Bolton at that time.
Line of stern.
Line of stern.
I see.
And I suggested to them that we might go into the figure 4 formation. I don't think they took to it very readily. But on about our second operation together, we got a perfect bounce against some 190s below us. And when we were flying in the finger 4 formation, and everybody got a squirt and so on and so forth, and I think the Canadian wing was sold on it from then on.
Could I ask you what mark you were flying at that time? When you
We were flying the 9, the Spitfire 9A.
And the armament in that had been improved as well?
The armament of that was 2 Hispano cannon, 2 20mm cannon, yes. And I think it was 4 3, well, the 303 was machine gun, was neither here nor there. But it was a pretty reliable cannon. And of course, the great thing about the Spitfire 9 is that it looked exactly the same as the Spitfire 5. It was just a bit longer, about 18 inches longer, but the Germans couldn't see that, you see.
Until it was too late.
So they thought it was probably an old Spitfire 5, which they were far superior to, especially with the Focke-Wulf 190. And we'd just say, let them come a little bit closer, boys, you know, and then we'll break in. So, and that was the best airplane in the European skies from 1943 till the jet airplanes came in, till the 262 came in. That was the Spitfire 9 was the best airplane.
So you've mentioned the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109. Now these obviously was the opposing force. The Spitfire could outturn these, I understand, but the Messerschmitt had the advantage at the higher altitudes. Is that correct?
Well, basically, I think the Messerschmitt, certainly in 1940, the Messerschmitt E was better than the Spitfire 1, a little bit higher, and it had better armament than the Spitfire 1. We only had the 8 machine guns. I mean, I'm going back to 1940 now. Yes. And also, it had the direct fuel injection with the Daimler-Benz engine. So when it half-rolled, it didn't cut out. When we half-rolled with our carburetors, we cut out and couldn't follow them down. We were more manoeuvrable, though. We could turn inside both the 190 and the 109.
In speaking to a pilot who flew with the a Canadian who flew with the RAF, he said that at that particular time of the battle, when flying the Spives in particular, that we were blip makers. And I had a little bit of trouble with that, but I guess this was referring to the opportunity, not the opportunity, but they spent most of their time turning when they were engaged with the enemy. This became a very important part of survival, this ability.
Survival was the only way of getting out, but we were lucky, you see, with with the Canadian wing because we were one of the first in the spring of 1943 to get the Spitfire 9, whereas the other Canadian wing up at Dieppe, they were on 5s, Spitfire 5s throughout that year.
Now, you were encountering Focke-Wulf 190s primarily over the continent. Your time out of England and out of Kenley, I guess, your flying time to bring you over the continent would have taken a great deal of your fuel supply. There's the return trip to contend with as well. How much time would you have had over the continent to engage the enemy?
Well, we get over there in half an hour back an hour. So most of our trips were 150 or 2 hours endurance. We did have, the Spitfire carried 87 gallons of fuel. We did have a 90-gallon, what we called a slipper tank, which would give us 3 hours and take us almost to the German border. But it was very cumbersome and not very pleasant to fly with. And I think the fact is that the Spitfire technically could have been turned into a good long-range fighter, just as a Mustang. But the Chief of the Air Staff at the time, Portal, ruled against it and said it must remain as a defensive fighter. Much to our regret, really, because it was the Mustang later on which came and took the fight to Berlin.
So your escorts then, in that case, your range, I believe, was probably in the order of maybe 200 miles into
something like that, yes. Escort range to well, not to the German border, no, not as far as the German border.
Returning to the armament, sir, of the Spitfire, I understand that there was modifications or suggestions made that spot concentration rather than shotgun effect would be more effective. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do. The spot concentration, which was really all the guns harmonized to hit, as you say, a spot at 200 yards or I think it was 200 yards, was for the good shots, the people who could shoot and that sort of thing. The shotgun, the harmonization where the guns were harmonized to cover an oblong about, I think it was about 8 or 9 feet wide and perhaps 10 feet high. So you've got the shotgun effect for the average shot. And unfortunately, many people could fly a Spitfire, a lot of people, but there weren't very many good shots. Ford was one, of course, and Mcleod, Wiley Mcleod, who was with me in the Normandy in 1944 and commanded Squadron in 144 wing. He was one of the greatest shots ever to participate in World War II.
I'd like to speak a little bit about him, and perhaps we'll do that when we talk about the Normandy campaign.
Yeah.
Returning to the Kenley wing, you had a number of pilots join you in Kenley. Two in particular, George Kiefer, Wally Conrad. These were referred to as the Gold Dust Twins, I understand.
Well, I don't know whether that's, they were known as the Desert Twins. I don't know about the Gold Dust Twins. They said no. And when I was the wing commander to a flying of the Kenley wing, the station commander was a man called, the group captain was a man called Jimmy Fenton. And he'd been out of the desert and knew Conrad and Kiefer. And like every organization, you've all got your little men at the headquarters who work for you and do jobs and so on and so forth. I mean, that's how the military exists, isn't it? And you've got a sergeant who knows the sergeants and so on and so forth. So he said, would I like Conrad and Kiefer in the Kenley wing? They're both experienced fighter pilots. They're both flight commanders, both won the DFC. And these two young men, I suppose they were barely 20 then in those days, came up from the desert, tanned, handsome, fit, splendid young chaps. And George Kiefer, as you know, became a wing commander and highly decorated. He was my wing commander flying at the end of the war. And Wally Conrad was shot down in France, made an epic escape, walked home and so on. Fine pair.
An incident, again, which draws attention to the channel was Kiefer crashed in the channel returning from a mission, and I understand that Conrad was particularly upset by this and was instrumental in launching a search pattern that went out.
Well, he wasn't instrumental in, I mean, it's my memory that Conrad was shot down into the outer harbour of Boulogne. And, okay, so the Walrus was going in there to pick him up and so on, but it's a very hazardous operation indeed. We knew he was there, we'd left airplanes over him at high altitude and that sort of thing. It was a calm day. the Walrus had got to go in under the guns of the Jones, and I mean, we're all bloody well for sort of which one were now? Which one was in the drink?
Kiefer initially.
Kiefer was in the drink. Well, Conrad comes storming in. What the hell are you doing, Winker? Let's get off. And so the wing commander was trying to get the bloody operation mounted properly so we could pick him out, which we did, and got him back.
Now, in Conrad's case, again, this he did not end up in the drink, but it was a mid-air collision that caused him to.
He went down into here, and a man called Flight Sergeant Shouldice went down, chased a 109 or a 190, and they collided, didn't they? And Shouldice, Walter bailed out, escaped from France, walked home. Shouldice, unfortunately, went in, coming home across the channel.
Now, sir, your position as wing commander, or as wingco, what exactly would your responsibilities be once the wing had launched and you were on either a sweep or an escort? Were you directing the entire operation by RT from a ground control point?
No, I was leading them in the air by RT, and so the title was wing commander flying, but it was really you were the wing leader. You were the senior fighting man in the air.
So the relative positions of the enemy attacking force would be passed to you. You would work out an attack plan for it?
Well, no, the radar, which was very good in those days, it's a long time ago, but the radar was good. And we'd be handed over from the sector operations room at Kenley, and we'd be handed over to a forward radar down on the south coast, who would vector us and give us steers and heights to put us above German formations. And that radar would work into about 200 miles into France, or 200 miles, let us say, from the south English coast. High up, of course.
You mentioned that when you went to the wing, you had some changes that you want to make, the finger four formation, and that you also mentioned that there was a fair success in the first mission. In the first week as well, it was quite good. I had the opportunity of reading this. So there were 11 victories. And
we got off to a good start. It was the spring. The weather was picking up. We got a good airplane, the well-trained squadrons, and so on. And we got some targets. We got good control, and we got off to a good start.
In this case, where you had an all-Canadian squadron, you mentioned that while you were perhaps forewarned that discipline would be a problem, it wasn't at all. How about replacement pilots? Would they have been Canadian as well as replacements were?
All Canadian. The only chap I ever had any problem in 2 years, 3 years almost with the Canadians was Burling. And Burling, George, was an individual, and he just wouldn't fit into any form of team fighting.
Now, he came back to your squadron from Malta.
From Malta,
yes.
I
would assume
yes.
more or less freelancing in terms of aerial warfare.
Yes.
And this did obviously not fit in with the...
Now, you see, the authorities read him wrong. They read Berlin wrong. What the Berlin should have done, they should have given him a long-range fighter like the Mustang, and perhaps a couple of men with him of equal temperament, and let them get on with their own private war. Let them go and fly to Berlin and back on the deck and make a bloody nuisance of themselves and so on. Because he was an individual. He just wanted to do his way. And I had him in when he came to the Kenley wing, and I talked to him. He was a flying officer, highly decorated. He was a scruffy, untidy man, and so on and so forth. And we made him the wing gunnery officer and the wing this and that too. But he just wasn't interested. He just, every time he flew with us, he just half-rolled and buggered off. Did his own thing. And my successor, Huey Godefroy, had to get rid of him. But he should have been treated differently. He should have been, he was a lone ranger, really, George, and should have been given that opportunity. Or brought back to Canada and taken off operational flying, but that's what he didn't want, that, did he?
No, that's true. He did return to Canada in a public relations function, but as I understand, didn't really enjoy it very much.
No, don't think he did.
Right. Now, the replacement pilots are getting around to that again. The British Commonwealth Air Training Program then had been pretty well cranked up here in Canada at that time, and pilots were coming out at a very high rate. Was this apparent to you in the UK and as a wing commander, the quality of the pilot that you were receiving? Had it improved, say, from 1941?
Oh, yeah, well, from me. I mean, we were getting pilots with 500 hours, 400 and 500 hours, and whereas 2 years previously, or 3 years previously, I got 190 hours and 10 hours on the Spitfire, or 12 hours on the Spitfire. And also we were getting a lot of instructors. There were a lot of people with a lot of 1,000 hours on, that sort of thing, who were wanting to get on operations, been instructing here in Canada. And they were very experienced pilots. So the quality, when the answer to quality, the quality of pilots coming from what was called the Empire Training Scheme was very, very high indeed. First class.
Now, a number of people who went over there and who had been instructors in Canada would have been perhaps a number of years older than the regular everyday line pilot that you might have had. Would this have placed additional pressures on these people? Or would
I think, yes. I think sometimes they weren't as malleable, let us say, if that's the right word, as the young man coming up and so on, you could mould and so on. And sometimes they thought they knew all about flying, but they didn't know all about fighting, and they were inclined, some of them were inclined to fly too much with the heads in the cockpit, instead of, I mean, I've got a thick neck, and my wife always tells me I've got a thick neck because it was mostly in this position.
Getting back to your neck being in that position and flying in the finger four, observation and was perhaps one of the most, or keeping a sharp lookout.
Eyesight, yes, eyesight, yes, it was yes, and most of the Canadians, especially people from out west, most of the people who'd been outdoor people, farmers' sons, huntsmen and that sort of thing, they were the people who could spot the airplanes.
They brought this naturally to the
I think so,
then.
yes, I think so.
How about RT procedure? This was also very important. You got a number of people up in the air, but I would assume as wing commander you were the one who would speak, and others would, initially at least. There wasn't the opportunity for idle chatter.
No, we take off and we go to our operational frequency, and I would just sort of say, I just check with the two squadron commanders, Bolton and Ford, okay Sid, okay Foss, to make sure the RT was okay, and so on and so. And then no more would be said until the forward radar controller picked me up and sort of say, "Grey Cap," that was my call sign. I received loud and clear and so on and so forth. No more would be then said until I either gave the order to attack or some member of the wing saw something which he wanted to draw my attention to. So there's very, very strict RT procedures.
Are those procedures that were being used, you would have initially learned at the hands, I would say, of Douglas Bata as well, and he was very, very much a taskmaster in that aspect as well.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I remember once when I sort of gave the false alarm when flying with Bata's wing, and I called a lookout. I saw some airplanes below me, and being a bit inexperienced, I shouted, "Lookout!" Everybody disappeared in all directions, that's the thing, and I had to face 36 Spitfires, and I had to face the wrath of the great man when I got back.
I imagine it was a lesson that was well learned, though.
I won't tell you what his words were. No.
Well, sir, you operated the wing out at Kenley for 6-7 months?
Well, that is from May until the autumn. And then in the autumn we moved down, we started rehearsing for the campaign in France, and we left Fighter Command and went into a thing called the 2nd Tactical Air Force, and we lived under canvas and operated from primitive airfields in Kent.
At this point, you took, as wing commander, you took over a different wing as well?
The Kenley wing became 127 wing of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, yes.
Now, the Canadian wing commanders who were with that wing when you went there initially, I believe, were Brad Walker, perhaps Wiley Mcleod.
Didn't see Wiley until the following year.
I
didn't see Wiley until the following year, 1944, when I formed a new Canadian wing, which was 144 wing, which consisted of 3 squadrons. I think they'd been in the Aleutians. There were 3 new squadrons from Canada, 441, 442, and 443 squadrons. But fortunately, the Canadian authorities said to me down in Lincoln, the Royal Canadian Air Force overseas, said, what do you want? And I said, I want a dozen good men, a dozen good flight commanders and squadron commanders, and got them. So we hired the pick of what was in England at the time.
Now this was the tune-up for D-Day?
This was the tune-up for D-Day.
The actual role of the Spitfire was going to change as well when you got to the continent. You were primarily involved in bomber escort, but it was going to be...
Well, it was air superiority, you were air superiority fighter, that sort of thing. You became a fighter bomber. Right. And they stuck, the previous year, they'd stuck bombs on the Spitfire, the 500-pound bomb, and We've been on bombing what they call the Noble sites, the V1 launching sites. I never liked that work. I thought the Spitfire wasn't designed as a ground attack aircraft. It was very vulnerable. You wanted a good rotary airplane, something like the Typhoon or the Tempest. And the Spitfire really was at its best on the air fighting role.
The aiming problem with the Spitfire, I understand too, with that single bomb presented some problems.
Well, I mean,
you never really resolved.
Never resolved. You went into about a 50 or 60 degree dive, pulled the target through, counted 3 and let the bomb go. I mean, it was World War I stuff really, wasn't it? I mean, there was nothing to it really. And our Broadhurst, who you mentioned earlier on, used to come and see me in Normandy, and he used to say, Johnson, he said, you don't seem very keen on the ground attack. You know, I don't see your name leading the ground attack missions. He said, I see your name all the time on the air superiority. And I said, you're bloody right, Air Marshal. I'm not so keen on the ground attack.
Now, the actual day, of course, is the 6th of June in 1944, and on that particular day, your squadron was assigned an area to patrol, I believe, over the British and Canadian sectors. This was a pretty dangerous area to be in, and flying an aircraft on that day as well, just from the volume of traffic and the number of guns that might have been pointed skyward.
Well, I don't know how many thousands of Allied airplanes there were on that day. I think I've seen, is it 19,000 or something or other, with the Strategic Air Force and the 8th Air Force, the 9th Air Force and various other air forces, and darting up, the cloud base was about 2,000 feet on that day. It's very thick cloud as well. Visibility wasn't very good, and you just, the danger wasn't the German Air Force, because we didn't see them.
They didn't
the danger, no. The air superiority had been attained, hadn't it, really, in the preceding years.
This was not just a matter of disguise. The actual superiority had been attained, and they were not available.
Not available, thanks to Bomber Command and the big offensive that had taken place in the previous year.
On the 6th of June, there was the problem with weather, and this delayed the operation from going in perhaps on the 5th or even the 4th of June. Were you aware of this delay and the potential delay? And
no, I wasn't. We were all in the beachhead. We were all sealed in the beachhead for about the previous week. And I learned at about 4 o'clock on the 5th that the big day was the 6th.
You mentioned that, were you living under canvas at that time?
Yes, we were.
This was down in Bournemouth or in the...
We were at a place called Tangmere. Tangmere. And we were living in tents and caravans and so on and so forth, and our caravans and tents, half of them disappeared well before us, and they were at the other side when eventually we got ashore on D+3 or whatever it was.
Now, you mentioned D+3. I have this record, so perhaps you don't mind if I correct you. I think it was D+2, sir. It was on the 8th of June, but it was actually one of your pilots, Del Russell.
Del Russell, yes.
Who landed in France.
Yes, well, the AOC called me up and said, we've got the first strip available at a place called Saint-Croix-sur-Mer. Will you or send somebody in to make sure it's serviceable? So I said to Dal, you take this strip. Go and land there, see that you get fuel and so on and so forth, and then when you take off, climb as high as you can, so you get a message back to me saying it's okay or it's not okay. So in about an hour and a half, the people, the brass back in the control centre, knew that we had got a good strip at Saint-Croix-sur-Mer in Normandy.
And then the squadron moved over there shortly afterwards and
Wing.
operated a
Three
wing,
squadron.
rather. Sorry.
Three squadron.
Yes. All right. If I could just ask one more question. On the 6th of June, this was obviously the big match, and the fact that the enemy didn't show up that day probably presented a problem to you in terms of your own people, telling them that the battle was still ahead, because I would assume there was a lot of attention drawn to that day, and there might have been even a letdown.
Well, I think there was a feeling, a bit of frustration, that's the thing, but we all knew, didn't we? I mean, especially those of us who'd been at it for a year or two, we all knew the recuperative powers of the Jabs. We knew that they put in a show sooner or later, and that's what I tried to tell the chaps. I said, you can be sure as hell that there'll be a counterattack, and there will be enemy airplanes for you to get, which there were indeed, yes, later on.
Now, you mentioned your accommodation at Tangmere was under canvas, and then of course when you moved to Normandy, it certainly didn't improve by any stretch of the imagination. You were continuing to live under canvas, but also having the benefits, if you call them that, of split trenches to jump in on occasion as well. I understand that life wasn't really that pleasant, at least not in the initial stages in Normandy.
Well, I tried the first night or two in my caravan, and the flak was sort of raining down on it, you know, and it wasn't very pleasant. And I discovered that the 3 squadron commanders were Dal Russell, Wiley Mcleod, George Hill has left us, and Dan Brown, that's right, from Dan, he was an American. And they, I thought, well, I wonder where these buggers are, how they are faring, you see. And I went out in the middle of the night to see how they were getting on, because they were in tents and I was in a caravan, so I had more protection. But they had found a German dugout, which was a German sort of command post, which was very stoutly constructed of reinforced concrete and electric light, and there the buggers were, very nicely holed up, so I joined them.
If I could ask your personal thoughts, sir, when you did arrive in France then on the 8th of June. This was an area that you had flown over.
We've flown over a long time, yes, we've flown over a long time, and I think that I think we were all very conscious, at least I was, that I mean, when you saw that great convoy of ships stretching from Portsmouth to the Cherbourg Bay, or the bay between Le Havre and Cherbourg, you were very much aware that a big part of history was taking place and so on. And I was very much aware when I landed in France that this is we'd been kicked out at Dunkirk, and this was retribution. We were getting back onto the mainland of France. We were made very welcome by the peasants and the villagers down there. And in fact, next year, which will be 1990, will be the 46th anniversary of our arrival at Saint-Croix. The local people, the farmers and the local Norman people, are unveiling a little plaque to 144 Wing and the 3 squadrons to commemorate that event, which we shall be going over to.
Now, the preparations that were made for the landing there included the construction of Mulberry harbors, the shipment of oil by Pluto beneath the channel as well.
Tremendous organisation.
It must have been. And
marvellous.
You'd have a daily look at this thing as you went on your sorties as well.
Well, the Mulberry, I think we never saw much of the Mulberry because I think that was sunk, wasn't it? Built and sunk the day we...
Yes. One was extensively damaged.
And of course, all we saw was every port on the south coast was just full of every type of ship and battleship and so on, and the Isle of Wight and all the roads around there and so on. But I mean, nothing ever sort of set course until the night of June the 5th, June 6th.
Now, the operations on the continent would have changed as well by virtue of nothing more than you didn't have to go back to refuel after an hour.
No, you got a lot more. You got a lot more leeway there.
So
yes.
The number of sorties then in a day would have, where they might have been 3 or 4 when operating on the continent, would have changed. And,
well, what we started to do was very interesting because we'd started off the war flying in squadron strength, and then we built up to wing strength, and Bata's big wing in the Battle of Britain, 5 squadrons. We got into Normandy and it went back to squadron fighting, really. There wasn't time, except for very special occasions, to form the squadrons into wings. You went off when the controller sent you off as flights or squadrons.
And again, they noticed that the enemy was approaching was probably almost instantaneous as well. There wouldn't be the opportunity to pick them up on radar, I guess, if they were coming.
We had some very good controlling in Normandy. We had the mobile radars which were sent over there. I think they were the Type 14s and the Type 18s, if that means anything to any radar people who are listening. And the controlling and the coverage was almost as good as it had been from the south coast of England. First class. It was good technical development.
I had the opportunity of talking with a squadron member who lives in Toronto now, previous to discussing your time in Normandy, and he mentioned, please remind the Air Vice-Marshal of our rations that we had over there, the compo rations in particular. Things were not that good. Food was there, but it wasn't really perhaps the sort of fare that the Canadian palate would have been more used to. However, I'm making a long story out of this, and what I'm getting around to is a gentleman by the name of Arthur King, who ran a pub called the Unicorn.
He did.
And I understand that this may have been the first takeout order that was, we're all familiar with takeout food today, but you instituted the same sort of policy back in 1944, on at least one occasion, where some food was sent over from the Unicorn.
Well, it was yes, there was several airplanes a day left Tangmere. The Unicorn was very close to Tangmere, And several airplanes would come a day as courier airplanes or bringing things like the old Anson, remember the old Anson airplane, that sort of thing. And Arthur would send lobsters and hams and fresh tomatoes and that, not for the whole wing, I mean that was impossible, that sort of thing, but just for the Johnson and his squadron commanders, where we had the lobsters and so on. And we'd send him back a few bottles of champagne and brandy, and it worked very well till the customs chaps got to hear of it and sort of got a bit shutty.
Along the same sort of ideas here, the retrofit of the Spitfire to carry the a 500-pound bomb had a side benefit in that this same device could carry a barrel of beer in.
Carry a barrel of beer under either wing, yes. A barrel of beer under either wing, yes.
Was this a regular feature, or was it just on special occasions?
Oh, special occasions, frowned on by some of the higher brass, of course, you know.
I also understand that there was a group of nursing sisters that had arrived shortly on the continent, or shortly afterwards, with the invading force, and these were always welcome guests at your cinema in the wing as well, when the opportunity presented
Yes,
itself.
they were, yes. I forget what field hospital it was. But they were very nice Canadian girls, and always, I might add, hasten to add, were very well behaved.
Now, I was perhaps making light of the situation in Normandy at that time, and I realized you were there on very serious business, and this was evident when the operation in the Falaise Gap began. Your role then, I guess, was primarily armed reconnaissance and
strafing, really, strafing. But we couldn't in Normandy itself, which is bocage country, you know, very heavily wooded and heavily overgrown with hedges and little roads and that sort of thing. And we couldn't find the German. We couldn't find the German armour and the German army to attack from the air. In those days, the fighter bomber didn't have the electronics that it's got today, which were largely developed in the Vietnam War. You know, the smart bombs and so on and so forth. And I couldn't, because the bocage country, the wooded country, only extended for perhaps 15 or 20 miles in depth and perhaps 20 or 30 miles in width and that sort of thing. There was most of the German 7th Army. And in fact, I took the trouble to go up to our front lines, took a jeep and so on, to see what the problem was, because we greatly outnumbered the German army, with the British, Canadian and Americans and so on. So, and there was, I mean, the German fighting army man was fought with great skill, and I think, I mean, in retrospect, he was superior. Perhaps his experience had done that to anything we could produce, any Allied soldier and that sort of thing. He fought very well defensively, and in small units, you know, of half a dozen chaps under an NCO, was very reluctant to give ground. And it was only until we got Bradley and Patton swinging around to the south later on, and we got him out into the open, that we could bring the fighter bombers down, and the Typhoons especially, and the Thunderbirds from the 9th Air Force, and into the great killing ground of Falaise, which was out of the bocage country. We got him out in the open there and could work over him, and took that terrible toll of all those. Well, I think we destroyed the German 7th Army virtually at Falaise.
So you would have been operating out of St. Croix and the killing zone for...
We operated in pairs. We didn't. We just. I said to when we saw these targets, we got all this German armour huddled together. I said, okay, just refuel, rearm, get off in pairs. Don't wait for a flight. Don't wait for a squadron. In pairs or even singly, because we've got such air superiority.
So consequently, the number of sorties in a day would be...
Oh, I don't know. Thousands.
Thousands.
Well, thousands from, I mean, don't forget there were 3 Canadian Spitfire wings, 9 Canadian Spitfire squadrons, and I think a further 9 Typhoon squadrons. I mean, most of that Air Force, that 2nd Tactical Air Force, was Canadian.
I understand there was also a friendly wagers going on as to the total number of victories that would be accomplished by D plus 30, and
we won.
Your wing won that.
We won. We had Mcleod there. You mentioned Wiley Mcleod, who was one of my squadron commanders there, and was a bit older than, I think he came from Saskatchewan. I think he was a bit older than the average. I think he was 30, that sort of thing. But he's a most remarkable shot. Very, very. I mean, he was one fighter pilot who could, really was an exception. And I remember seeing him destroy 2 enemy fighters one evening when he was flying with me. with 13 rounds from each gun. I mean, that was quite phenomenal. I mean, I took the trouble, time to go over to his airplane, see how many rounds he had fired, because I saw him in the air, just boom, 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 boom. And there were 13 rounds from each 20mm gun. So he's quite a remarkable fighter pilot and very extremely fine shot.
It was his intention to be, I understand, from your book, Wing Leader, to become the leading Canadian fighter pilot during the war, and he spent time looking at gun camera films and developing, I would assume, tactics.
Didn't relax easily, Wally. He was a very intense man. And I last saw him over the Rhine later on, after Arnhem, and we bounced a bunch of 109s. We were in an absolute perfect position. And I last saw Wally sort of hurtling almost vertically upwards on the tail of something. Never saw him again. His Spitfire was later found. We could only conclude that they'd gone into a sort of stronger formation up high somewhere.
This, I believe, sir, if I recall, was in September. And
September,
this was when
1944.
You got your 38th and final victory.
That's right. That was the time.
Mission as well.
That was the same mission.
Had McLeod survived the war, do you think that he would have stayed within the military and pursued a career there? Or there's no doubt that during the period that he was engaged, that this was a vocation with him. Did he have the temperament, perhaps, to serve in a peacetime military organization?
I don't think so, no. I think, you know, there are certain people who are ideally suited to war, aren't they? Sort of Bata was one, for example, who would never have taken the discipline of rules and regulations of a peacetime organization, but who came to his own in the war, like so many Wingates and the Sterlings and the Desert Air Force, the people in Vietnam, Special Forces and so on, who would never survive in peacetime. Wouldn't want it, would they?
Now, after Normandy and the German force had retreated northwest, I guess, across the Rhine, across the Seine initially, your wing was then continuing to press forward yourself in that direction. There were a number of quick moves, I understand.
Well, they sort of, what they did, the 144 wing was disbanded and we had another sort of reorganization, and I went back to the old Kenley wing, which was 127 wing, commanded by a chap called Bill McBrien, who's now dead, and he stayed with us as far as Brussels. And then who should turn up as the CO but the one and only Turner turned up to take over the Canadian, be my boss.
You had been with McBride right from 43 when you first went with the Canadian wing.
Yes. And I think Bill, I mean, he wasn't his father a commissioner of the Northwest Mounted Police, I think, was he?
Now, as you moved up through the Northwest, the moves were very frequent. You ended up going in through Belgium and eventually into Germany as well. If I could just ask one or two questions about the opposing force. The Germans were obviously withdrawing, but it was by no stretch of the imagination was it game over or easy pick.
Well, they gave us a nasty knock at the Ardennes, if you remember, when they came through the Ardennes, and we thought all was, I mean, we thought we'd really got them on the run, but as I said before, the German is an exceptionally good fighting man, which might lead me into another subject about the reunification of Germany. Anyway, we'll leave that to the politicians, won't they? I mean, they bounced back, didn't they, in the Ardennes and so on and so forth. They struck us on January the 1st, hit all our airfields, that sort of thing. The losses were heavily camouflaged. We lost a lot of airplanes that day. The truth was never reported to the press at the time.
Operation Bodenplatte, I understand.
I forget what it was called.
Also, the jet at the German Me-262 made its appearance as well. And this,
we had first seen that at Arnhem, yes, and we couldn't cope with it. But I mean, I was talking to a bunch of Germans last year, and they said, you know, I was sort of saying what a good airplane the 262 was, and they said yes. And did you know we had 750 at the end of the war? I said yes, I knew you had 750, but you didn't have the bloody fuel to make them go, did you? You see, that's what sort of did to me.
Now, the first one that was shot down by a Canadian. This was Dal Russell, I understand, or not Dal Russell personally, but perhaps his
126 wing, yes.
But he was an interesting point with him. I understand that in order to get in on the D-Day thing, he approached you and asked to take one of your squadrons.
We'd lost George Hill. We'd lost a man called George Hill, who was a Nova Scotian, a very famous fighter pilot with the DFC and 2 bars and everything. And then Dale rang me up and said, could he have George Hill's squadron? And I said, well, you're a wing commander, Dale. And he said, well, that doesn't matter. I want to be in this show. And he said, I'm quite happy to revert to squadron, which he did.
He was, in a short time, re-promoted to wing commander.
Became the wing commander and that sort of thing, and he was a super chap, Dale. Very nice bloke. We lost his brother, Huey Russell, in Normandy, unfortunately, but Dale was, he's still here in Canada, of course, and I see him from time to time.
Now, if I could just bring up one other name, and this was a name that we've introduced already, and this was George Kiefer, who had now, by the time he had reached and crossed the Rhine, had reached the rank of wing commander himself, and was in...
Right, he was my wing commander.
In 127. On a particular incident, there was a strafing attack that was taken in mid-April, I believe.
I know it was. I remember it was right towards the end of the war, and George was leading the wing, and I was leading one of the squadrons. It was one of the few wing shows we did, and we'd gone looking for trouble towards to the east, to Berlin, and George flew us over a well-stocked airfield called Pochim, P-O-A-C-H-I-M. I remember it after all this time. And we were flying at about 12,000 feet or something, 12 or 14,000. Flak came at us. They were all knew we were there. And then old George went up, sun for about 10 minutes, then came down, lie down. I thought, well, Christ, can't possibly going to be attack this lot, because they were all ready and waiting. But in he went with his number 2 and set fire to a dozen airplanes about to take off.
And both he and his wingman came out the other end?
He got away with it. He got away with it. They were very brave, very hazardous, and a very brave piece of flying, when we all knew it was only just a question of days before the thing was going to fold up.
When the war ended, sir, you were on the continent then, and did you have a chance to have a look at some of the German aerodromes that you were...
I had a chance to look at Belsen, which was next to where we where Kiefer and I finished the war, at a place called Celle. And my doctors came in and said, there's a concentration camp, you better come and see it, because it was just the most sort of appalling thing I'd ever seen in my life. These thousands and tens of thousands of Jews all dying and being gassed and so on and so forth. Belsen.
I would suggest that perhaps this, in your own mind, at least let you think that the job that you had done during the previous 4 years had certainly been well directed.
Worthwhile, yes. We didn't understand the mentality which would treat people like that, and so we didn't know, and I don't fully today.
When the war ended, sir, you were then at the rank of group captain. And did you decide at that time to stay in the RAF?
Well, the previous year, 1944, the Royal Air Force had selected, or a few people like myself, they'd written to me and said, would you consider staying on as a permanent... They offered us permanent commissions, which I took, because I'd always wanted to get in the RAF, and I also wanted to be a fighter pilot, and so I thought, well, this is the life. It wasn't quite the life from there on, was it? Quite afterwards, but I enjoyed it.
You were then exposed to our day, or what we call our day in Canada, was reversion day, where you were required to drop a rank.
Required to?
To drop a rank.
Well, we all dropped ranks, yes. Some of the poor chaps had to drop too.
I see.
But I went down to Wing Commander, and it took me till the career more to get it back again.
One of your post-war postings was to Canada, I understand, to the RCAF stuff.
RCAF stuff. It was shortly after the war up at Armour Heights, yes. Yes, where there was some good Canadians there, and it was certainly what they called a sabbatical year. We didn't have to work too hard, and we drank a fair amount of whiskey. And
I would imagine you had the chance to renew acquaintances on this side with some of the pilots.
Oh, did.
Yes,
we did. But not many of them stayed in the Royal Canadian Air Force. I mean, Dal Russell, he left. Kiefer, Conrad finished up as being president of some Olympic Airways or something or other, and then he was down with Braniff, and he was an airline man. George Hill became a doctor, and very few of them stayed in.
Now, you then went on to a tour in the United States as well, I would imagine, as a military attaché.
No, I was just what they called an exchange officer down at Langley Field in Virginia.
This gave you the opportunity of getting to Korea.
Gave me an opportunity to get to Korea, and it was a period I very much enjoyed. Langley Field, they had a lot of airplanes. The Sabre was just coming, the jets were just coming into service, and so on.
Sir, there's no doubt in my mind that being asked to select your favorite aircraft, it would be the Spitfire. However, could you compare it with the Sabre? Now, this was perhaps your first. The Meteor and Vampire had appeared in the UK.
The Sabre was far, far superior to either the Meteor or the Vampire. They were awful airplanes, I thought. Heavy and slow and not much faster than the Spitfire. But the Sabre was it was a step forward. Very nice, yes.
Would it be fair to say the Sabre was the Spitfire of the 50s? Would it
I think it was. It was a very fine airplane. You made it here in Canada. And then the Super Sabre, the F-100, that was also, which I flew, that was also a very good airplane.
Now, following this, then you flew operationally in Korea as well.
Yes, I did.
Was this with the American squadrons in patrols?
Yes. With I flew B-26s, which are primarily to see what it was all about in Korea. Then I flew the F-80 and then the F-86. But I didn't shoot any MiGs down.
I see. Had the tactics changed appreciably from
just the same?
Just the same.
The tactics really changed. It was the Vietnamese War, the war in Vietnam, where the smart bombs and all the electronics, where for the first time in history, you could shoot a man down without physically seeing him. You know, you could shoot him down for 10 or 12 miles with the various missiles and that sort of thing, once he'd been identified as hostile. That was the big technical advance, the Vietnam War.
Your next to last posting then was at Cottesmore as a commanding officer at RAF Cottesmore for the first Victor bomber station as well.
Yes.
So obviously you were checked out to fly this bomber as well.
Flew the Vulcans and the Victors, yes. And it was an interesting time, and Bomber Command was getting all the priority at that time with its nuclear weapons and so on, and I'd never been in Bomber Command, fortunately, because I think they had a very hard life of it compared to us. The casualties were, enormous casualties. You took sort of 30% chance of getting through your first tour of operations. And some of them did 3 tours, but still, they were fine people. So anyway, to come back to your question, yes, I flew the Victors and the Vampires, then I went out, and my last job in the Air Force, commanding the, what they call the Middle East Air Force, which was then based in Aden, and we had squadrons in Kenya and Bahrain, and we had responsibility for what we call the High Commission territories down towards South Africa then. So that was a very interesting assignment.
What was the aircraft that was being flown operationally at that time?
Well, we had Hunters, Lightnings, we had Hunters down in the, as it was called then, the Royal Rhodesian Air Force, and I used to go down there quite a bit because Ian Smith had flown with me, the Prime Minister of New Zealand had flown with me in 125 wing, and George Kiefer back in 44, so he made us very welcome and so on. And Africa is a wonderful place. It's sort of, once you've lived in Africa, it sets some sort of seal on you. You want to see it again.
Now, you retired, sir, in 1966.
Yes.
But I'd just like to close this off by asking you a little bit about the Johnnie Johnson Housing Trust, which I believe you've been instrumental in founding.
Yes, well, I founded that shortly after I retired from the Air Force. It builds homes, for what we call sheltered homes, for retired people and ex-service people, and it's been reasonably successful. We've got about 100 of what we call these sheltered homes, mostly in the north of England, and housing 3,000 people, some of whom are veterans from the war.
It was, I'm sure you were very proud of the fact that the first group of homes that were referred to, where the first home perhaps was referred to as Kenley Lodge.
Kenley Lodge, opened by Sir Douglas Bata himself.
Well, sir, on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for this interview. If you'd like to, we could give a little spot on the tape here to have you talk about the book that you're in the process of writing one more time. Will this cover your experiences through the entire war, or will it focus on...
Well, I was in the midst of writing a book, and then Hutchinson's, who have been taken over by Random House, I don't know whether we're allowed to say this sort of thing, but anyway, you can cut it out, we're not. And last year, before they were to take over, the managing director said, no more war books. All war books out, he said, you know, no more war. So the when they get taken over for 80 million by Random House and so on and so forth, the new chap comes in and said, where's the war books? Got no war books. So a fellow called Laddin Lucas and I have done an anthology on the Battle of Britain. An anthology is selected writings, poetry and so on and so forth. I have done the first chapter of 5,000 words and the verdict on the Battle of Britain, the conclusion. And in between it is a pure anthology of going back to Henry V and Shakespeare and so on. And I think it's just a bedside book, And some of Richard Hillary's writings, you know, The Last Enemy and those sort of people. Some of Churchill's quotations, some of Goering's and so on. I think it'll be a nice book. And you can buy one for about 16 quid.
Well, the interview that we're just completing here will become part of the museum at Trenton, and again, I'd like to thank you very much for your time. I can only guarantee you that the museum will also stock a copy of your book as well. But on behalf of the museum, I'd like to thank you very much. It's been a most interesting time for me, and I'm sure for people who see this, it'll be equally as interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. It's been a pleasure.